with the rise of digital technologies for fans, we've really seen a sense of participation and engagement, and the same is true for authors. So showrunners have become much more public figures in the past decade, using digital tools like blogs, Twitter, and fan forums, as well as personal appearances at conventions like Comic-Con. And these showrunners really maintain a personality that transcends the individual program and creates the illusion that fans have a sort of relationship and understanding of what's going through the minds of these creators. And that sense also becomes a sort of realm of forensic fandom, people trying to analyze. So what did Ron Moore from Battlestar Galactica say about this episode, and how does this play into my interpretation of it, and how do I parse these two different elements? And this is also maintained through official paratexts like DVD commentaries and extras, making of videos, podcasts, and the ways in which these showrunners make themselves known in a way that, if you were a television fan in the 1980s, odds that you knew who was in charge of a given TV show were pretty slim. There were very few instances where a showrunner had any sort of public identity beyond the credit at the end of the episode. But these paratexts have made the voices of showrunners widely known and oftentimes establishing a particular personality. So certain showrunners have a particular style. So Damon Lindelof, I referenced earlier, is a big Star Wars geek, and he plays up this fan-friendly buddy mentality, this real sense of, look, I'm a fan too. And you can see this in other showrunners. Russell T. Davies, who was the showrunner of Doctor Who when it came back in 2005, really foregrounded the fact that, as a kid, Doctor Who made him want to become a TV writer. And that was his inspiration. And he's a fan first and foremost, and he'll always do things to service the fans. And that sort of mentality, this fan-friendly accessibility and sense of I'm one of you, is really crucial to a lot of showrunner personas. And, you've got to remember, these people are writers. They're not big Hollywood stars. They tend not to be as sort of polished and beautiful people the way that actors often are. And, they're not used to having this sort of public persona in this way. They tend to be gruff. They tend often to, speak their mind. They're also really, really smart, so they have a lot to say about a lot of things. I mean, David Simon is one of the more entertaining interviews you can read because he speaks his mind in really eloquent fashion, and it's very compelling in that way. So I think the ways in which showrunner paratexts, interviews, and commentaries have really fueled this sense of authorship as a site of engagement, where fans want to learn about these creators, and often feel an allegiance and accessibility to them as these fan-friendly buddies, but they also have to assert themselves as controlling authorities. So oftentimes this conflict emerges where this sense of, Damon Lindelof tries to say, I'm your buddy, I'm a Star Wars geek, I'm a fan, but I also know more about the show than you do, and don't tell me what to do. And that dynamic can be very awkward at times, and fans have complex relationships with them. And then serial, one of the most interesting things is the way in which paratexts become sites of serial engagement themselves. So, the paratexts of podcasts are particularly interesting here. A lot of shows, Lost, Battlestar Galactica, and Breaking Bad, for instance, have weekly podcasts. So after each episode airs, they'll post a podcast of the creators, the showrunners, talking about the given show and that episode. And for a lot of fans, that becomes a site to sort of fill that gap in between episodes, but also serial engagement in and of itself. So fans not only come to expect the next episode of the show, but also the next episode of the podcast. And certainly I've had the experience, I know other people have, who listen to these podcasts. You watch the show, and you see a certain moment, and your reaction is, I can't wait to hear what they'll say about that in that week's podcast. Because you want to hear about what went into that decision. You want to hear about how they produced that, moment, or hear the perspective behind the scenes of how, the Ron Moore's term is, you want to hear how the sausage is made. And that sense of understanding it forms a frame for how we comprehend and engage with serial narrative. expecting the paratexts as well as the texts themselves. And this points to a third key facet, which is that authorship becomes a component of media reception itself. So reception is a site of authorial production. And I'd say arguably authorship is most important in the reception process, as that's where the rhetoric of the author function becomes active, shaping viewer processes of interpretation, evaluation, and engagement. Now, before I explain how, I want to take another detour here into literary theory to talk about the concept of the implied author. Now, this is a wide-ranging concept developed by Wayne Booth in the 50s. And I don't want to delve into the history that much, but I want to contrast two different ways that film scholars have talked about the implied author. The first is Seymour Chapman. And Chapman very influentially has written about film narratology, and he says that the implied author serves as the source of a narrative's origination. Quote, the agent intrinsic to the story whose responsibility is the overall design. So his concept is the embodiment of textual intent. So when we ask, what does a film mean? He says, what we're trying to understand is, what does the implied author mean? And Chapman, and everyone who uses the term implied author, is very clear. This is not the biographical author. This is not the flesh and blood person who makes this, but rather it is the sort of agency that intends meaning. Okay? And that agency is embedded in the text itself. So it's the meaning-making agent. And for Chapman, we personalize that in this embodiment of the implied author. The second critic I want to talk about is David Bordwell, who refuses this model and says implied authors are useless. They're not a useful addition to our analytic toolkit. He thinks that a film's storytelling techniques themselves are sufficient for conducting narrative analysis. And he gives us this long quote. As for the implied author, this construct adds nothing to our understanding of filmic narration. No trait we could assign to an implied author of a film could not be more simply be ascribed to the narration itself. It sometimes suppresses information, it often restricts our knowledge, it generates curiosity, it creates a tone, and so on. To give every film a narrator or implied author is to indulge in an anthropomorphic fiction. In typically subtle ways, Bordwell is saying no. Okay, so for Bordwell and Chapman, they agree, and I mean the two of them, they agree on 90% of their narrative theories. This is one of the key points of debate. But they both agree that the text itself is the agent of storytelling. Okay, they're not claiming. Neither of them are claiming that the real biographical author is in charge. They say, look, the text means. But Chapman says we need to embody that meaning with this anthropomorphic fiction of an implied author. And Bordwell says, no, a narrational system is sufficient for doing this. Now, I don't want to weigh in on sort of argue one is right or one is wrong. I tend to lean more with Bordwell here. As an analyst, I think we can look at textual intent without providing an anthropomorphic agent behind it. But I'm not interested in doing that because I'm more interested in the pragmatic question of how do viewers make sense of these texts. And by doing that, I think that we can look and we can say that viewers do indulge in an anthropomorphic fiction. Viewers create implied authors as they're consuming these texts. They think about who is doing this. And we can see the broad circulation of authorial paratexts as a key evidence of that. You know, viewers want to understand how something was created. They want to draw upon these paratexts to piece together, you know, what did Joss Whedon or Damon Lindelof or Ron Moore mean by these given episodes, and how can I analyze these paratexts to make sense of them? Such authorial construction, it's not lodged solely in the text, as it exists in these moments of television reception within the broader contextual circulation of author-function discourses and paratexts. So, in my chapter, I propose a new term, which I call the inferred author function. And I use the word inferred because it's not just implied. It's not an implication of the text, but rather it's an active process of viewers inferring. So the agency shifts from the text implying an author to the viewers inferring an author. And I want to highlight still this term function to tie to Foucault's notion that it's a discursive circulation, not just sort of an active creative process. So my definition of this is that the inferred author function is a viewer's production of authorial agency responsible for a text storytelling, drawing upon textual cues and contextual discourses. In more practical terms, when we watch a program and wonder, why did they do that? The inferred author function is that they, the agent responsible for the storytelling. Now, some viewers probably don't do this. They think in a less human notion of the show, as in, why did the show do that? But I think that the prevalence of authorial discourses in paratext suggests that for many television viewers, agency is lodged within this imagined construct of a personified authorial force. I can't believe that there are people who are listening to these podcasts with authors talking about how they make these choices and what they were aiming for, etc., and then they watch the show and don't activate those notions of authorship in their consumption. There are certainly people who don't consume the authorial paratext and watch the show and don't think about who's doing it. And it was interesting. I did a version of this talk in Mannheim a couple weeks ago, and one of the people there said that she hadn't really thought much about who was behind the creation of these texts until 2007, when the writer's strike happened. The Hollywood Writers Guild, there was a writer's strike and all these shows shut down. And there were picket lines and she started following this and she started thinking about the people who were actually making these things. And she said afterwards she couldn't now help but think about that. So, her inferred author function was activated through this paratextual sort of exposure to the Writers Guild strike. And it changed her comprehension processes in this way. And I think, again, I'm not saying this is a universal mode of engagement. There are a lot of people who watch these shows without forensic fandom. There are a lot of people who watch these shows not trying to sort of imagine authors in this way. But I think there are enough people who participate in this form of reception that we need to really think about it more closely. And this ties back to one of the main concepts I talked about yesterday, which is the operational aesthetic. If we are thinking about the ways in which a complex television show, highlights its own storytelling process, I think the operational aesthetic encourages viewers to think about authorial agency, not just marveling at the way that the show did something, but the way in which our imagined, inferred authors did those things as well. Additionally, seriality encourages this inferred author function as it helps us fill the gaps between episodes. And it encourages these interactions with authors, whether they're imagined interactions like listening to a podcast or literal interactions of, tweeting with a showrunner. And we fill these gaps with these conversations and paratextual consumption, and for some people, production, like the orienting paratext that I showed earlier. And notions of authorship are an important frame that works within a lot of these practices. And there's a long history of this, of authors engaging with their readers, both real and inferred. Dickens corresponded with readers fairly regularly and published letters and had the type of correspondence. Comic books often have a letters to the editor page in each monthly installment where readers will write in and then the writers or the editors will correspond with them. There's a real sense of dialogue there. And again, this is all helping to construct these inferred authors. And it's done through serial texts to the point that authors themselves become sites of serial engagement, thinking about how does an author's personality or how does an author's, what they're saying about a show change over time. And again, for me, I think that for many viewers, not universally, but for many, many viewers, the inferred author function serves